Good afternoon, everyone. We'd like to welcome you for today's webinar, Geoscience for Renewables, which is being hosted by PIA School of Petroleum Studies, together with in collaboration Total Energies Professors Association and also Total Energies Marketing Kenya. We have on call our guests from the respective organizations. However, before they introduce themselves, we'd like to start with a brief safety brief, stating that we hope that none of you is driving, and if you are, kindly make sure you come to a completely safe stop. We are not obstructing any traffic or pedestrians. We also hope that with the current weather conditions, you stay alert and ensure that you are aware of your surroundings whenever driving. We also hope that you are aware of your safety emergency response procedures at your current meeting location. And in case of an emergency, you are aware of any emergency exit points which may be used to safely exit your location. Apart from that, we also encourage people to observe mental health as a safety issue at their workplaces and even at homes and their working environments, given that you ensure that this can be done by ensuring you listen twice, you speak once, words that uplift, and things which by ensuring that the messages that you send on social media or even on email or even on messaging apps ensure that they are messages that uplift people, and in the process will be a safe mental health ambassador. With those few remarks, I'd like to hand over the microphone to Margaret from Total Energies Marketing Kenya to do an introduction for us. Margaret.
Thank you very much, Alfred, and good afternoon to everyone. Thank you very much for making time to join this webinar. We are very proud to have partnered with PIA to deliver this webinar on geoscience for renewables in conjunction with the Total Energies Professor Associé, also known as TPA. TPA is an independent non-profit association supported by Total Energies Foundation. Its main objective is to promote relations between the world of energy and universities or colleges through technical, economic, scientific, legal, or marketing presentations that are offered by expert professors. The association has more than 250 professors who are currently working with Total Energies or have since retired. And today we have the privilege of having Professor Nicolas Nosjohn, who will share with us some insights in today's topic on geoscience for renewables. Professor Nicolas is a seasoned geoscientist with over 20 years of experience in the energy sector. Currently, he holds the position of Senior Geoscientist at Total Energies, where he specializes in prospect generation and evaluation across the North Sea, North Africa, and the Middle East. Professor Nicolas began his career in 1999 as a 2G geomodeler in Cameroon, focusing on seismic and petrophysical interpretation and 2G integration. Throughout his career, he has contributed to numerous successful EP projects and has held various senior roles, including leading exploration efforts in Norway, Egypt, Azerbaijan, and the US Gulf of Mexico. Additionally, he has been involved in renewable energy projects such as geothermal, CCUs, and offshore wind in France and the North Sea. Academically, he holds a PhD in geosciences from Paris-Saclay University and 2 master's degrees in geology from Unisalle Polytechnic Institute and geotechnics from Art et Métier. He's also an active contributor to academia, where he lectures in various universities and shares his expertise in geological and geophysical tools and methods, and their application in both petroleum and renewable energies. Welcome, Prof, and over to you. We are happy to have you on board.
Thank you, Margaret, for this introduction, and hello, everyone, and thanks for being present for this conference, where I intend to detail the use of geoscience tools and techniques for renewable energies. So yeah, so I've already presented. So yeah, I'm currently a senior geoscientist working in Total Energy head office in Paris. Currently working for Middle and Far East regions. So regarding a couple of hours that we will have together, so in order to set the scene, I would like to start with some basic recaps regarding the energy fundamentals, their landscape, and their global impacts. And then we will drive together to the different world of energy transition and different applications on offshore wind, carbon capture, geothermal, seabed minerals, and native hydrogen. It's really a new world which is opening to us for the energy transition. And I will finally draw some conclusion and way forward. So in case of you have any questions, so feel free to write them in the chat, or we will have a dedicated session at the end of the talk. So I count on you also, Margaret, to let me know when you need a break, because I propose to have it yeah, in the middle of my talk, but let's see how it goes. So let's start with some basic and key reminders about energy fundamental. So as you may know, the word energy comes from the Greek energia that has been developed by Aristotle. And energia has no direct translation to English. It is frequently described as the ability to do work. So despite this confusing definition, its meaning is very simple. So energy is really the force that causes things to move. So without energy, there is no movement, no light, no life. So there are many forms of energy that we are grouping in general in two types of energy for doing work. On one side, the potential, or what we call the store energy, where you can find the chemical energy, elastic energy, nuclear energy, and gravitational energy. And on the other side, the kinetic or working energy, yeah, with the thermal energy, mechanical energy, electrical energy, and magnetic energies. So all these different types of energies has been used since decades and since big ages to do what we need to get the energy in different forms. So energy drives every form of movement. So walking, running, biking use a chemical energy that is derived from the food we eat to fuel our muscles and to keep us moving. The train uses either electrical energy or combination of thermal and chemical energy generated from fossil fuels. So in fact, what is very important to understand is that energy is a conserved quantity, meaning that energy can be converted in form, but not created or destroyed. We have learned how to change energy from one form to another and then use it to do our work, creating what we call the life cycle of energy. So this principle is known as the conservation of energy, or the first law of thermodynamics. So here you've got an example. If you have an input of 60 joule electricity in, you will have conversion in a light bulb into heat on one side, which will remove 45 joule of energy, and also the light energy that we need. So if you know the law of conservation of energy, you will have 60 joule on one side, and you need to have 60 joule going away. So the light energy will be 15 joules. So you see, with this process, most of the energy that we have used is lost. So we want to get most of it for our usefulness. So this is what we are working on since decades. So also we have understood the many aspects of the physics of energy for a long time. We are still trying to create better and more efficient processes to harness and to use this energy. So for that, we need to find an energy sources that is basically a phenomena by which we're going to extract energy. So this is the definition of energy sources. So as you know, we are classifying energy sources into two main categories, the renewable on one side and the non-renewable or the fossil energies on the other side. So there are four types of fossil energy, coal, oil, gas, and nuclear, and 6 types of renewable energies, which are solar, aeolian, marine, geothermal, hydraulic, and biomass. So all these energies can be used either to produce primary energy, such as heat, or they can be used to produce a secondary energy sources that we often call an energy vector that will be, for example, electricity or hydrogen. So energy sources can be compared and further classified using different characteristics. So energy density, energy performance, the surface area it requires when you need to build a certain plant, its cost associated to the production and to the maintenance, its abundance and distribution worldwide, which will have a big impact on all the geopolitical world that we have today, its availability over time, and also the conditions that will be required for storage, for transportation, and as well as for distribution. So its impact on the environment also, it's a major concern for us today. So let's discuss now on how and where this energy are used worldwide. So let's start with a small quiz. I don't know if you have access to your comment pane, but so do you have an idea of what is the environmental impact of the entire life of the entire life cycle of 1150 watt microwave? So are we in a low gram per CO2 equivalent, or are we in the high side of the CO2 equivalent? Are you more to 30, 35, 48, 57, or are you more until very high values? So if you can give me your thought in the chat, let me check if I can get some answers. Alfred, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. I'm just trying to create a poll so that people can be able to quickly.
Yeah, sure. Just to understand, because you sent me an email asking to the meeting link is not the good one I am using?
No, you're using the correct one. It's okay.
Okay,
You're okay.
perfect.
Yeah.
Sorry for that. So obviously, there is a trick behind my question, and no answer will be right and no answer will be wrong. Basically, the idea, the carbon footprint is definitively vary by country. Why it is so? Because its carbon footprint depends on the type of primary energy that is used to transform it into electricity. So in countries where the electricity is coming from for renewable, like we have in France, or with using mainly nuclear, or Denmark, where we are using mainly aeolian, the carbon footprint is rather limited. On the contrary, where the carbon footprint will be far higher in countries using carbon energy, such as Poland, which is mostly using coal to produce its electricity. And you see, in Kenya, we are in the good class for the carbon footprint. So the solution that has been developed since nearly 20 years now, it's what we call the energy mix. So it's referred to the distribution between the different primary energy sources used for the energy consumption of a given geographical area. So in other words, it is a combination of different primary energy sources that is used to produce electricity, fuels, and heating means. So each country has its own distribution of energy mix based on its available resources, electricity demands, and as well political and economic problematics. So this mix is really essential to ensure energy security and to avoid supply disruption in case of any issue with a specific energy source. So all of this, it's based on 3 key pillars, which are flexibility, sustainability, and complementarity. So today, this energy mix, as you know, is mostly dominated by carbon-intensive energy for energy consumption, but as well as for electricity production. Is any of you knows the Kenya energy mix distribution? So it's extremely unique energy mix distribution that we have all over the world. It's the only country that has this type of energy mix. And this energy mix, basically, it's coming from 85 to 90% coming from renewables, led by geothermal in a big part, and hydropower plants, which are strategically located across the country. Nevertheless, we can say that this mix is not enough today to cover the energy demands of the country, as around 6 or more % of energy is imported within the country. So in terms of percentage of energy consumed since 1960, we have seen a slow change in the ratio between the consumption of oil and coals on one side, the consumption of natural gas and nuclear on the other side, and all what is renewable energies on the last side. So I put here a triangle where you're going to see from 1965 to present day, the evolution of this ratio between very hard carbon intensive, less hard carbon intensive, and renewable energies. So you see it's moving from decades from hard carbon intensive into nuclear and gas. And then from 2010, basically, we can start to see a shift towards renewable energies. Even if we have really stagnating today, oscillating between 60–70% of coals and oil, 30% of nuclear, and 5 to 10% for renewables. So during the 20th century in the world, the range of primary energy sources has really expanded. Each has been consumed in increased quantities without replacing them. So this is a first important information. So in terms of evolution, we are there today. So where are we going? So towards a world where renewable will be predominant to reach the EIA scenario to stay below the 2 degrees of temperature increase, or rather toward the mix of increasingly varied energies, but with potentially more restrictive environmental, social, and economic issues. So we don't really know what will represent the likely future. Today, we are expecting that the carbon intensive energies, such as gas mainly, will still lead a key role in the future together with renewables and maybe hydrogen. But why bother after all? So I will not go back to the reason why this paradigm shift need to be made urgently. We are already heavily overwhelmed by hundreds of new worlds highlighting the impact of human activity on the climate. The reasons for the climate runaway are well known now and unequivocal. Carbon dioxide and methane, which are, even if they are only a very small portion in the atmosphere, are critical gases for our planet. So it's key for us really to reduce them and to eliminate these greenhouse gases, even if we know that this will not immediately stop the global warming processes, as this gas, like CO2, having a big longevity in the atmosphere in the order of a century, but also because of the fact that our system Earth has a delayed response to this global warming. So given the complexity of the problem, which involve both physical and biological constraints, there is no single solution. So we must find the right balance, or let's say differently, the good complementarity between these two key words that are mitigation on one side and adaptation on the other side. So for energy companies, what does that mean? It's necessary to find solutions that will meet criteria of accessibility, reliability on one side, environmental impact on the other side, but also obviously profitability. So this is where geoscience can enter the game. So the geoscience play really a major role in the energy transition. They are really essential for exploring new sustainable and decarbonized paths, as we can see in this drawing, which is showing the major fields of application of geoscience. So I will now detail a little bit in some words, in some slide, the key ones that are used for the energy transition. So let's start with the application of geoscience for offshore wind. So first, do you know what causes wind? So is it the rotation of the Earth? Is it that the sun, which is heating the atmosphere? It is a variation of the Earth's surface elevation, or it's a mix of all the above? So with this quiz, it's quite funny to highlight, giving you the response, that basically the wind, it's basically a solar energy, because the wind is coming from the air pressure difference driven by the sun heat. So as you've got the air pressure, so you will get winds from this unequal, the difference of inequality of the Earth. So as we discussed with the first law of thermodynamics, the wind energy harvests the kinetic energy of the wind and transform it through the gearbox into mechanical energy and convert it, thanks to a generator, into electrical energy. So we have already three modifications of the energy from the wind to the kinetic, to the mechanical, and finally to the electrical energy. So there are two key physical information I would like to share with you. So first is this one. So the energy that the wind turbine can generate is obviously function of the wind speed squared. So basically, what does that mean? If the wind speed is multiplied by 2, the electricity produced will be multiplied by 8. So the more wind, the stronger the electricity you will produce. Similarly, the electricity produced by a turbine increases with the length of the blades squared. So this is this formula. So if we increase the length of the blade by 2, we will have 4 times more electricity produced. So to have more wind in terms of quantity, in terms of stability, and therefore to be able to place large wind turbines, we are favoring, since less than a decade now, the offshore domain. So as you can see on this map, it's the average capacity factor of the wind. So ranging from 20 to 65% for the maximum. We are here looking at offshore, nearshore area. There is a huge capacity factor of offshore wind worldwide, really everywhere, mostly in the northern hemisphere, but also to the southern hemisphere. So the main offshore wind farms are located mainly in the North Sea. There is a strong movement also today in Australia and as well in the east coast of the US. So currently, another point to raise for technological reason, offshore wind farms are located in shallow waters, so up to 60 meters water depth, and around 30 to 50 kilometers away from the coast, from the marine traffic routes, from any strategic naval installation or any space of ecological interest. But the goal that we see since 3-4 years is to get further away from coastline to get stronger winds. And this is what we are aiming to get by 2030. So the objective of the geoscience application in this domain are twofold. First is to define the best site to place all the elements that are constituting the wind farms. So the turbine and their foundation on one side, the offshore substation that is taking all the array cables that are buried into the ground and convert the electricity to bigger electricity in order to be able, through the export cable, to export to the onshore substation and to the normal grid. So we need first to define the best site to place all these elements and also to place all their foundation on the seabed, either a gravity-driven platform for up to down to 60 meter water depth or anchors for the floating platforms. And we need to do that as safely as possible. So you see here the different type of platforms which are on one side gravity-based, on the other side floating platforms. So for your awareness, nowadays in 2024, 98% of the offshore wind farm are gravity-based. There is only a very few which are floating due to the fact that we are still in R&D phase for these targets. So key questions that will be raised for the offshore wind engineering team will be how to install my pile straight at the location. What is the optimal foundation design? Can I use full site, or are there some geohazards that I need to know and to avoid? Are my cables sufficiently buried, depending on the wave impact and the sea currents? What is the optimal cable route from my offshore wind farm to the onshore? And how can I make a real business model in the safer and the quickest manner? So for that, geoscience is part of the answer. So to give this appropriate answer, we're gonna run some key surveys. First, we will have the offshore wind engineering design team, which will analyze the main wind physical characteristics through what we call the METOCEAN campaign. So the goal here is to measure precisely the wind speed at location to assess the expected energy production, the expected design infrastructure that we need to do, and the operational limits. So we will analyze the wind energy roses. So what is the orientation of the wind, the strongest wind? Are there one orientation or different orientation depending on the time? What is turbulence intensity? So do you have strong wind in the morning and less, it will be less in the afternoon, or is it depending in season and so on? What is the vertical wind profile? So is it something that is, you've got stronger wind if you go higher from the sea surface, or is it something that is more constant, more homogeneous? So all of this will need to be assessed precisely to understand what we call the wind budget. Then you will have a joint geophysical and geotechnical campaign to assess the soil characteristic for the various foundation design. So for that, you will have first geophysical campaign. It's obviously a non-destructive campaign where you're gonna run different tools like seismic acquisition, like sonar acquisition, like ship surveys, sub-bottom profilers, and so on. It's indirect method to have an understanding of the geophysical characteristic of the ground. In order to link the geophysical to the geological area, you need to do some additional geotechnical campaign. So this will be really the link between the geophysics and the rocks. So what are the characteristics of the soil? Is it stiff? Is it hard sandstone, or is it shales? And what is mechanical properties associated to this first 100 meters of sediment? And depending on the response, we will place different type of foundations. So for us, geoscientists, the ultimate goal is to create this. It's a 3D subsurface geological model. And this needs to be done over the entire area that will be used by geotechnical and geomechanical engineers to understand the type of foundation they need to do and the depth we need to bury this foundation. So we start with bathymetric acquisition to identify any potential hazard on the seabed. Then various seismic acquisition will be carried out to characterize the site from a lithological and a structural perspective. So we will create some geological provinces that are linked with different geophysical information. Then you will have the geotechnical acquisition steps. It's necessary to take representative samples on the different areas that has been defined thanks to the geophysical campaign, and then to characterize these geological assemblies from a mechanical, from a deformation, from a stability, from a pressure point of view. And we will use different lab measurement tests to help us. So after that, we will deduce a geomechanical model, which will define all the constraints that can be applied on the different structures. And finally, the synthesis of all this data is carried out via a final geological model to select the type of foundation necessary for the installation of the offshore wind farm. So many innovations have taken place since the rise of offshore wind about 10 years ago. The main change really has been on seismic acquisition and processing, where today we are able to have much higher resolution that we are used to in the oil and gas domain. So to get an idea, the current survey standard for offshore wind farm is a bin size of 50 centimeters, where we are in a standard of 12.5 meters in the oil and gas domain, a vertical resolution of 0.1 milliseconds, where we are in a standard of 10 to 20 milliseconds in oil and gas, and a frequency content ranging from 2 to 5,000 hertz. where we are more in a standard of 5 to 150 Hertz only in the oil and gas domain. So we are really in a different world in terms of resolution. So we are currently developing inversion model to expand basically the geotechnical response, which is the key for us, from well measurement. So what we call the cone penetration test. So these are measurements we are doing at each expected offshore windmill location. But we need to have this in 3D. So you are using, we are trying to find a solution to link seismic data to CPT measurements through inversion model. And then we will be able to create 3D geomodel of geotechnical measurements. So let's dive now to CCS, and after we will do a 10-minute break if it's okay for you. So what is CCUS? So CCUS stands for Carbon Capture, Storage, and Utilization. So it's a set of technologies aimed at reducing carbon dioxide emission into the atmosphere. So the sector which has the greatest potential for using this technology are the industrial sector, particularly the cement and concrete industries, as well as the energy sector, with carbon capture really at the outlet of the gas or coal-fired power plants. So these two sectors, so industry and energy sectors, represent approximately 60 to 70% of the total of carbon dioxide forecast capture by 2050. So we have different capture technologies that are divided, as you can see here, into several families, depending on when we will intervene to capture the carbon dioxide. So the most developed capture technologies being to date what we call the post-combustion, the oxy-combustion, and the post, so pre-combustion, oxy-combustion, and post-combustion. When you have to understand really one of the key issues that we are facing today is the capture of the CO2 is taking the process to capture CO2 take a lot of energy. We are estimated up to 20% of the overall power of a power plant. So if you want to add a carbon capture device into your power plant without losing any energy that is produced through this power plant, you need to increase your capacity of production by 20%, which is today a very big challenge for a business point of view. So next step is the transport of CO2. So it is done on two ways, either thanks to a network of pipeline, where CO2 is compressed to the point of reaching a quasi-liquid state that we called supercritical form. So again, we have also some concern. For example, today we are not able to reuse the previous oil and gas pipelines due to the fact that the CO2 gas is extremely corrosive, more than methane. So we need to find solution to be able to reuse this oil pipeline in order to reduce the overall cost of a given CCS project. Another way to transport is trucks or ships. Their carbon dioxide will be transported in liquid form at a pressure of 15 bar and a temperature of roughly minus 30 degrees. So important point for the transport is the storage capacity must be really located as close as possible to the areas that emit carbon dioxide. Otherwise, the question of transport will become insoluble and you will never get any business case. So then we are dealing now with the utilization. So part of the captured CO2 can be used for the agri-food or the chemical industry for various purposes, as I illustrated in these small sketches. So you can do bioconversion, mineralization. So you can do mineralization to create calcareous to build roads, catalytic conversion, integration into different devices, or electroconversion. These are the most well used today. However, the needs are far much lower than the quantities that would need to be treated to fight climate change. Today, the U is 5% of the CCUS solution. So we need another solution that represents really 90% of the need, which is the storage of the carbon dioxide. So it's the final S letter. So with there three main types of storage that are currently attracting the interest of experts that are deep saline aquifers, depleted hydrocarbon reservoir, and enhanced oil recovery techniques. You have also other techniques that are still in research and development stage, as the coal seams, ECBMs, and the basalt. So basalt being the one that we are really looking at in detail nowadays for R&D side in TotalEnergies, for example. So why the interest? So there is a worldwide growing interest in CCUS as the EIA scenarios indicate that this solution could contribute up to 15, maybe 20% of the reduction of global carbon emission by 2050. So it's really something that is really to take into account. Other interest to reduce CO2 will be finding new means for road transport, and also a big part need to be done to get better isolation of buildings, and as well as moving from coal to power into gas to power. But for our concern of today, which is CCUS, it can represent a big part of the solution. So as you can see on the left graph here, most of the estimated global storage capacity lies in the saline aquifers. So the idea behind that, it's involved injecting CO2 into reservoirs that are filled with very salty water that could not be used for agriculture or industrial processes. So the goal for us is not to inject anything into drinkable aquifers or aquifers that can be saline, but not saline enough to be used for agricultural. So as you can see on the right-hand side, the saline aquifer geological formation can extend over very large area at sea and on land, and they can offer very long-term storage capacities. So to be usable for carbon storage purpose, this saline aquifer must meet many geological criteria. So first, from a capacity point of view, as a geoscientist, we're gonna work on the reservoir parameters, which are the key, which will be the reservoir extension, the thickness of the reservoir, its porosity, and obviously its permeability. Then, from a containment point of view, that is to say, the integrity of the reservoir, it's really a key concern in CCS. There we will look at all the potential hazards that may affect the reservoir and the sealing capacity during the injection. And obviously, injectivity, it's also a key concern, as we need to inject a large quantity of CO2 as quick as possible without breaching, obviously, the trap. And finally, we need to ensure that the CO2 will remain in the reservoir for a long time. So for that, we have compulsory steps to be done, which are the reservoir monitoring. So this reservoir monitoring technique are developing really widely and importantly in the domain, mostly driven by what we call the 4D seismic survey. So which is basically a 3D survey that is repeated over the time. So what we need to see by doing so is to validate the path of the different CO2 injection plume during the injection, but also to detect any structural integrity issue. As I show you there, what are the key structural integrity is to have some faults that can be reactivated through the injection and create leakage into other aquifer or even into the surface. You can have also old wells in case and you are in depleted reservoir. If you don't have any good cement, this can be acting as a leaking path. You can have also a diffusion through caprock in case your sealing capacity, your top seal is not sealing enough. If you got, for example, at a part, a good shale that is moving with a lateral facet variation into sandy shale, then you may have some diffusion. So the idea of this monitorability is to validate the path that the injection is taking through time. So despite the geoscience challenges I just described, and that we can cope basically thanks to experience in E&P domain, there are some remaining challenges to be seen. One of the key ones is the important scale up.
Your audio?
Yeah.
Your audio, it's a bit low. You can check on the volume.
I'm gonna try to see if I can do that. Sorry. So I see I'm at maximum. Let's see if I can increase. Is it better like that?
Okay, it's okay. It's okay. We can continue.
Okay. So what I was telling, one of the key issue, so you've got the geoscience challenges on one side. On the other side, we have an issue with the scale up that we need for to meet the carbon reduction objective. Because of the fact that today in 2024, we are injecting 40 million tons of CO2 in the ground. But we need to inject 2 gigatons by 2030 to be in the net zero emission scenario. And today, what we have planned is very, very far from what the EIA is asking us to do. Another challenge to tackle is the business model, which is not there today at all. Every company we are doing CCS is really losing money. So we need really to find a good leverage with strong political actions for the regulatory framework and having the key CO2 emitters in proximity to the carbon storage side. So this will be the key enablers in order the CCS to move forward. So that's what I had for the CCS. Maybe we can have a 10-minute break if you want. Is it okay for you, Alfred?
Yes, what you can do is I'll just unmute the mics for the participants to ask any questions. during this break. And
Yeah,
then,
perfect.
so let me just unmute the mics. So if you have a question, kindly, you can just use the raise hand feature as I'm unmuting the mics, and then you can ask the questions accordingly. So I think the mics may be unmute in a few. So if you have a question, you can use the raise hand feature, and then I can be able to open your mic. Any questions?
Maybe clear enough.
Okay. You can also type on the chat box if you have any questions as you go on. So the mics are now unmuted. So you can just, if you have a question, just kindly unmute your mic and ask a question. Okay. So far, so good. I believe that people have been quite attentive during this session. And to ensure that nobody drops off the call, I'll just issue a few questions. I'm seeing something typed on the chat box. There's a question: after the carbon has been captured, how can it be reused as an energy source?
Sorry, I'm looking at the Q&A. So after the carbon, sorry, can you tell that again?
After the carbon has been captured, how can it be reused as an energy source?
For the reuse of the carbon. So it's not an easy task, indeed. Huh? Let me show you. Should be that one. So in terms of so once you capture it, so you are you need a big amount of energy to capture it. Then you can so basically you need to have several type of filters that are also you need to really select the different a certain concentration of CO2. Everything is based on the concentration of CO2. So for bioconversion, for example, you will have a different type of algae that can eat the CO2 in order to develop themselves. For mineralization, you will have a different another way to do that through injecting a lot of pressure and temperature in order to convert far more quickly the automatic mineralization of CO2. When we are injecting CO2 in the ground, there is a part that will be mineralized, but it will take an average of 1,000 years to do so. So it's quite huge. So we have found some solution in the labs in order to speed up this process to create really mineralization with high concentration of CO2, adding some water. But again, all of this is very energy intensive consuming. That's why today, all this utilization process really remain something that is anecdotic.
We have another question. What is the output of CO2 purity during the carbon capture storage process?
So during the carbon capture process, so it's a very good question. I have not any answer to give you. I am not working at all in this part, but from what I understood, the purity need to be quite important in order to avoid any other trouble when you are into the transport phase. So that is to say, it's the purity need to reach 80–90%, and if not, you cannot cope for CO2. Therefore, that's why this you have to run this type of filtering, which is very, very energy intensive. But no, I don't have the detail, unfortunately, to give you a proper answer on that.
Okay, maybe the last question is regarding the costs associated with carbon capture technologies. It's a high cost and high capital intensive operation. So how can maybe we may be having a financier or bank in this webinar, and they may want to know how can we be able to be able to leverage on the uncertainty and the return on investment on such a project.
Yeah, so the return on investment there today, basically, it's something that some of the oil and gas companies are betting, basically. Today, we are not there yet. The only country in the world where we are starting really to make a real business is in the US. The only reason is the carbon tax. If you are reaching a tax which is above $200 per million BTU, then you can start to have a real business case. So we are far in Europe for that. And there is a lot of lobbyists working also on one side, on the other side. So this is a big part of the decision. Then the other one will be the regulation. To have really a political action for the big emitters, which are cement factories, which are other industries that like cement, like steel factories, that really need to be forced by laws to go to this process. Then the big part of the cost is the transport, because of the fact that you need to have a different transformation. You get the CO2 from the emitter in the capture process that you are transforming the gas which is emitting, you are transforming it into nearly pure CO2. Then this CO2 needs to be moved into supercritical phase. So you need to build a plan for that. So second transformation. Then when it arrives to the area where you want to store it, it will need to be re-liquefied through another plant. So a third modification. And then it will be modified automatically depending on the depth and the pressure and temperature associated to the depth of the storage in the ground. So you've got 4 phases of transformation. Among them, 3 are very energy intensive, and you need to have a lot of inputs, OPEX and CAPEX, to be put in the balance. So if you are reducing the transport, you will be able to find really to make a deal happening from an economical point of view. The point is to reduce as much as possible these boxes, which are open and which are OPEX and CAPEX intensive, to be able to make a case.
Yeah, I believe that was sufficient. So I think there is no other question so far. So I think we can be able to continue. Is
Okay,
that okay?
good. Yeah, perfect.
Yeah.
So let's move now to geothermal energy, which shows that the Earth itself is renewable energy sources. So geothermal energy, it's very well known in your country, obviously. It's a type of renewable energy that comes from the heat derived from the ground. So we can distinguish two main origins of heat source. So first, what we call the low-grade heat, which is stored in shallow subsurface, so below 200 meters, largely derived from the solar radiation that is absorbed by the ground and distributed via natural groundwater system, or sometimes even artificial structures, just as flood coal mines. So the ground here acts at the solar battery. So this low-grade heat energy is widely described at what we called ground source energy or shallow geothermal energy. And it's generally used for urban heat and climatization in the cold countries. The other type is what we call the high-grade heat source. They are located in the deep earth, and they can have three types of origin. First is heat from when the planet formed and accreted, and which has not yet been lost. Second is frictional heating caused by the denser core material sinking into the center of the planet. And the third one is the heat from the decay of radioactive elements. So this high-grade heat energy has the strongest potential for electricity generation, and this is what we are really looking for worldwide. So today, geothermal energy represents less than 1% of the global energy mix. So we are at 0.6 in 2024. But it offers really a significant potential in countries located in the fracture zone of the lithosphere plates, in ridges, in rifts, where the geothermal gradient is high. So that is to say, you are exceeding 10 degrees per 100 meters, but it can reach up to 1,000 degrees every 100 meters in volcanic or rift region, such as in Iceland or New Zealand. So here you've got the 10 top geothermal countries where you can see they are located in these high energy potential areas. And Kenya is far well located there. It's number 8 in the row. So the geothermal potential of a region depends on several factors. So including the local geology, the depth to which it can be drilled, and the technology available to extract and use the heat. So therefore, as also some regions have geothermal potential, not all the regions are equally suited for exploiting this resource. So basically, for geothermal, we are facing a double challenge. A first subsurface challenge, where the focus is done on the analysis of the needs, the management of the infrastructure, and the access of land for the exploitation. So this need some socio-economic analysis will need to be done to validate the viability of a project. So the second challenge is a subsurface challenge, with first geological for the geothermal potential of the area where the request was formulated, but also technical to assess the technical feasibility of the project. So all of these factors will need to be analyzed one by one in detail to validate the startup of a geothermal project. If one is not is showing a no-go, it's the full project that will not be able to be launched. So from a geoscience point of view, the geothermal exploration process begins with a preliminary assessment of the total thermal potential, which is the energy available for production of the reservoir. So it continues with several reservoir characterization steps based on geological and geophysical tools to determine the heat flow potential on one side and its associated productivity. Then the reservoir engineers enter the games for improved permeability design based on the assessment on the heat flow potential and the associated productivity. So the last step includes the well planning to identify the exploration and production steps that will allow the heat recovery from the geothermal sources. So for your awareness, when we are starting a project and when we have an idea of what is the heat flow potential, what we're gonna recover at the end of the process is 5% of the heat flow potential. Due to the limit of the technology that we have today and all the associated geoscience, so geological limitations. So you need really to have an extreme heat flow potential to have a viable case. So as for offshore wind, new innovations have been implemented to better characterize the reservoir and geothermal flow migration paths. So main innovation has been done on seismic acquisition, processing, interpretation, really to better image the seismic, subseismic faults and fractures, which are the key for the heat flow to move into the ground. And there have been also a lot of work done on 3D modeling for the geothermal flows, based again on inversion products, considering the different geomechanical uncertainties and migration paths. So geothermal here, it's a unique and reliable source of energy. It has very positive outcomes to help the energy transition, but its adoption will for sure remain limited unless a less cost-effective method will be developed, especially for heat flow recovery, especially for the different power plants that we need to put in place in order to change the heat into electricity, or additional technological breakthrough to look for extreme high heat, like mid-ocean reaches, for example. Why not going directly into the center of a volcano to get the extreme heat? But today we are still in a very, very R&D stage for that. Seabed minerals. So seabed mineral exploration is known really for a long time, but it's gaining significant attention since a couple of years due to the pressure applied on the onshore mining industry to deliver the key minerals that are needed for the modern technologies, including renewable energy system, electric vehicle, and electronics. So seabed mineral exploration techniques. So what does that mean? It involves the search and the study of mineral resources located on the ocean floor. So we know that these resources are rich in valuable metals such as copper, manganese, nickel, cobalt, and even rare earth elements. So they are associated with global tectonic borders and spreading and subduction zones, subsea volcanism, abyssal plains. So these seabed minerals occur in 3 types of deposits. First one is the polymetallic sulfide, which are found near slow-spreading oceanic ridges, and they are associated with active and relic hydrothermal system. We are here at depth between 1.5 to 3 kilometers. Then you've got polymetallic nodules that are found again on the deep sea abyssal plains, even sometimes at greater depth, between 3 to 5 kilometers. And eventually, what we call the cobalt-rich nodule or cobalt-rich crust, found as coating of deep sea mounds at 1 to 2.5 kilometers. So you have a different type of minerals that will be associated to these 3 types of deposits. And the idea for us is to be able to look for concentration of these deposits in terms of volumes, but not only, also in terms of mineral concentration. For example, we will never go for a cobalt-rich crust, which give less than 20% of cobalt within the crust. Otherwise, it should not be, we will not get a business case. So we have a lot of cutoffs that we're gonna apply to check the validity of a given area. So, as you can expect, these seabed minerals are spread all around the globe, but mostly in international waters, and mostly explored nowadays in the northern Pacific Ocean. So we are in international waters. We have the International Seabed Authority, ISE, that regulates since 10 years now the mineral-related activities. So they are the authority which is delivering exploration and exploitation contracts to several countries. Which are the most active one to date is China, it's Russia, India, and Japan. So the mineral exploration of seabed minerals, it's a 3-step process. So the first stage includes a preliminary regional reconnaissance to identify the large area of mining interest compared to environmentally sensitive areas. So there, the goal is to detect the potential valuable areas. So for that, we have different tools. We have satellite imagery with different radars that can detect metallic information over the sea surface. When we have that, the second phase focus on the precise mapping of seabed mineral extension, the thickness, as well as the concentration of minerals. So for that, we're gonna do what we call the small-scale reconnaissance analysis, when we will put ROV, so remote vehicles, to get some samples, and as well some geotechnical studies to assess the type of ground where these different mineral deposits are located. This is extremely important to assess basically what should be the best method of mineral extraction that we can do. When that is done, we will quantify this deposit in terms of geotechnical perspective. Again, to understand the mechanical properties of the seabed, to understand the ocean currents, to be able basically to detect what is the best method to recover the seabed minerals, to have the least, the lower as possible impact over the environment and especially the marine life. We want to do that in the most environmentally friendly way. So in terms of tools and technologies needed to best image and quantify these resources, we have a very high resolution seismic survey that is essential, basically, to identify seafloor surface structures, features with very high signal resolution. And recent advance in seismic acquisition geometries also on remote sources with multi-sensor streamers have proven really their usefulness for this as the same issues that we have for the offshore wind, but here with much greater water depth. For offshore wind, you remember we were stopping at 60 meters, maybe going to 200 meters for the floating offshore wind farms. Here we are at a minimum of 1.5 kilometers of water depth. So, and in addition to this acquisition, as for the land mining industry, we are using some new geophysical measurement like electromagnetic or magnetic measurement to identify and quantify basically the resources of mineral deposits in terms of size and volumes that can be produced and that can be business driven. So to conclude on this topic, the exploration and extraction of seabed minerals really hold a great promise for addressing the global demand of critical minerals that are needed to cope for the energy transition. But we are still constrained. It's essential to balance the economic benefits on one side with the environmental protection on the other side, as well as ethical consideration. Remember that most of these areas are located in international waters. So you have an ethical issues. Why a country which is exploiting this will have the right to get access to these resources? It's belonging to the humanity, it's belonging to everyone. But so there are some ethical considerations that need to be also discussed. And this is also the part of the International Seabed Authority to give some guidelines and some rules not to overcome. There are still a lot of room as well for continued research, technological innovation, international cooperation that really will be key to unlock the potential of these seabed minerals, while again ensuring the sustainability of our marine ecosystem. So today, as I told you, it's really developed in the Pacific Ocean. It's starting in the far North Sea, in the Norwegian waters, but to date there is no business case, there is no official commercial production at this big depth. It's only R&D stage, but we are expecting to move up very, very quickly and to have several production cases already in 2030. So last part I would like to discuss for our geoscience for energy transition journey is native hydrogen. So as you may know, hydrogen is the most abundant chemical element in the universe. It makes up 75% of the mass and 90% of the volume of all visible matters in stars and galaxies. It has really amazing characteristics. It's the simplest and the lightest element of the periodic table. Atomic number 1. Atomic weight, just a little bit more than 1. It has also a very high energy density. So 1 kilogram of hydrogen having the same energy density as 2.5 kilograms of gas, for instance. But it has also some inconvenience at its extreme flammability, its low ignition energy, and which are basically generating an issue for storage. You can see these two examples of human disasters following the use of hydrogen. So the Hindenburg airship explosion in 1937 in US, and the Challenger shuttle explosion in 1986. So currently, hydrogen has two main uses. As you can see on this graph, it serves as a raw material to produce ammonia and methanol as fertilizers. Really, half of it is used to do that. And a big part as well used as a reagent in the process of refining crudes into petroleum products, fuels, and biofuels. So most of the hydrogen today that we are using is not native hydrogen, is produced hydrogen by means of a chemical reaction from a primary energy sources, mostly being today coal and gas. So this is what you see. You have the primary energy. Here you've got natural gas, for example. So you have a factory that will basically put the carbon on one side and extract the dehydrogen on the other side in order to produce the hydrogen. So the production of hydrogen from coal source, it's called black hydrogen. The production from hydrogen from gas source is called gray hydrogen. If you add a carbon capture option into the hydrogen production of using fossil energy, this will call the blue hydrogen. And this is the technology which is widely developed today. What we tend to do as well is to produce hydrogen from renewable energy sources. So it can be aeolian, it can be sun, it can be hydropower. And then through electrolysis, you will generate hydrogen. So then this will be called now green hydrogen. And this is what we tend to go very, very quickly. And the goal is to have this green hydrogen being the key production means by 2030. And today, the key production means is the gray and black hydrogen. So hydrogen is also developing since a while, a decade more or less, for electricity generation. So it's that regard, it holds a great promise for decarbonizing several sectors to support the energy transition. Why? Because it has basically a profound duality with electricity, with a capacity for what we call a direct reciprocal transformation. So what does that mean? When you have a surplus of electricity generation using renewable energy, we can transform this surplus of energy into hydrogen. And then you can store. And when this renewable energy is not enough to produce electricity, you can back transform hydrogen into electricity to use it. So it seems to be quite easy in the process. There is a very big drawback that we have to cope today, is we are using basically 75% of the electricity produced with this reciprocal transformation. So if you are producing 100 of energy, after the change to hydrogen and back to electricity, you will get only 15 to 25%. Sorry, if you have 100 on one side, you will get 15 to 20. So there is a big loss in the electricity yield. So to overcome this challenge, a solution that we are looking is basically to find hydrogen directly into the earth. That's what we call a native or a white hydrogen. It's not a hydrogen which is produced by chemical means. It is a nitrogen that we will find directly into the subsurface. So natural hydrogen emissions, they are known on Earth for a very long time. So in the smokers of oceanic ridges, in volcanic areas, and also in cratons, where they are often marked by depressions that are called Fairley circles. So, what are the origin of the hydrogen? The Earth basically is continuously produce natural hydrogen through several chemical reactions, mainly related to the oxidation of ferrous minerals, the radiolysis of the water, and the maturation of organic matter, as well as the degassing of the Earth's mantle. So the exploration of potential natural hydrogen resources is still at its early stage. To date, the exploration strategy is focusing on areas where ferrous iron or natural radioactivity is present and react with water. So this is what we call the serpentinization process. So this is the first type of reaction we are looking at. So, however, this hydrogen being a very reactable molecule, it can be consumed by many oxidants and therefore destroyed during this migration. So, to be able not to image the petroleum system, but the hydrogen system in its globality, we need to use a combination of methodology technologies, which are coming from the oil and gas, but not only, also for the mining industry, and as well as the geothermal industries. So it will be necessary, for instance, to acquire very deep seismic data acquisition, ideally down to the mantle. It's really multi-kilometers acquisition to be able to understand where the mantle is located and how we can react with the different crust. And this acquisition will be coupled with gravimetry, magnetic, and even electromagnetic data that we're going to combine into 3D geomodels. So if we want to disrupt an unwide global economy that is today based on fossil fuels for more than 100 years, if you want to disrupt and unwide this thanks to the use and manufacture or even natural hydrogen, this will take time and investment. So for a timing point of view, we are still in the proof of concept phase. And we are still trying to evaluate the historical natural hydrogen discoveries we made 20 years ago. So we are still very far from large-scale development. So nevertheless, native hydrogen is opening new frontier for exploration with technique and tools that are still need to be fine-tuned. We have them thanks to the oil and gas industry, but we need to fine-tune them to reach the level of resolution for the estimation of commercially viable resources. So let's now conclude my talk. So as you have seen, the notion of energy transition is not as simple as it seems. So in the 2000, scientists really introduced the notion of Anthropocene to designate the irreversibility of the process triggered by human action on the Earth system. So over time, this material world has become an increasingly vast and complex matrix, which is interweaving a greater variety of energy, which are each consumed in greater quantities. All primary energies have grew up and accumulated without replacing each other at all. So at the end, the global warming has really become a tragedy of abundance and not a scarcity. So in that regard, what we need to do is a balanced and coherent energy mix that are facing climate issues. That's what really to need for a clean future. And this energy mix, it's important to be area or country based to be as efficient as possible. So the very wide geoscience expertise here play a key role through relevant acquisition, relevant analysis, relevant interpretation, access as well to successfully carry out all the renewable projects as shown here, and all the geoscience profession and technologies used in these different fields that I wanted to summarize on this slide. So, so I hope you know a little bit more now the use of the geoscience in the theme of renewable energies. If you want to go into more detail in the process, in the workflow, in the tools, and also what is the link between from a pure political and development point of view, I am proposing through a Total Professor Associate, TPA, a one-week course. So if you are interested, don't hesitate to contact me. And if you have any question regarding my talk, I am happy to take it. Thank you. So in case you have any questions, you can also write to me directly. I will post my my email address into the conversation if I can. Is there? Yeah, you have my my email address on the lower right corner of this slide.
Alfred, we can't hear you.
Hello,
Alfred,
can
are
you
you
hear?
there?
Can you hear
Now
me
we
now?
can hear.
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Oh,
We've not heard you
apologies.
for a while. Yeah.
Apologies. Oh, so I was just saying maybe closing remarks from Margaret, Total Energies, and then we can be able to have, we can be able to close the session.
Okay, thank you, Alfred. I don't know whether you were speaking earlier. We didn't hear anything. But on behalf of Total Energies, I just want to say a big, big thank you to all of you for taking time to attend this webinar, and a special thank you to Nicolas. It was very enlightening to learn more about the topic, and we hope to engage in future webinars to come. Thank you also to the team from PIA for making this happen. Over to you, Alfred. Asante.
Okay. Thank you so much also for the attendees for listening in and participating throughout. We are going to share the recording plus the presentation on as a link on email, and also the video will be uploaded on the PIA YouTube channel. And with those few remarks, we'll continue engaging further. We have another webinar coming up on 6th of December, and this is on health and safety regulatory frameworks, and it will be done by Professor Franco. And we hope that we are going to have you all on call during the session, and we look forward to having you also on the same. In regard to the future, we know next 2025, we have a lot of webinars and also courses planned ahead. So we know you'll be seeing Professor Nicolas, again and again and again during these sessions, and we look forward to the sessions also. Thank you so much, Nicolas, and thank you everyone, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.